So today we're going back to our series on what is truth. This is the third message on that. The first two messages we had have covered these topics right here, these four. That truth is not belief, truth is absolute and therefore objective, truth stands alone, and truth is the antithesis of untruth and therefore the target of untruth. So this week we're going to move on to point number, guess which one comes next?
6.
Oh, you're so close. 5. So close. Missed it by 1. The fifth point in this series, truth stands up to the test of time and every other litmus test. Truth will stand up to and will pass the test of time, and it will stand up to any litmus test that you want to throw at it.
What's a litmus?
Something that tests how valid it is.
I thought you were going to
Okay.
test how
So there are numerous tests in this category that are used to validate authenticity. So how do we know that any document or writing or collection of literature is true? That gets to the question, how do you validate its authenticity? And there we use a series of litmus tests and see how they stand up to those tests. So we can apply this to the question, is the Bible true? And to find that answer, we can use the same litmus tests that we use for any other document and see how it stands up to those tests. And those documents can be ancient or contemporary. You can use these same tests regardless of how old the documents are. So what we're going to do in this message and next week, we're going to go through some of those tests, okay? But before I do that, if you refer back to the previous point that we had on here, that truth is the antithesis of untruth, and so it's therefore the target of untruth. One of the most telling reasons that we know the Bible is true is because it always has been, always will be, relentlessly and mercilessly attacked by the darkness. In fact, no other book, writing, or collection of literature has been more attacked, more abused, more criticized, more scrutinized, more destroyed, more misinterpreted, more maligned, more targeted, more challenged, and on and on and on than the Bible. So, based on our previous point, before we even open it up and read it, this fact alone confirms to us that the Bible contains truth. Should be one up here, son. Oh, I'm sorry. You were where you were. My bad. So, because, as I said in the previous point, truth is the antithesis of and therefore the target of untruth. So what about the test of time now? Although the Bible has been more attacked than any other document in history, the Bible is also the most read, the most printed, the most translated, the most revered, the most sought, the most desired, the most admired, most enduring, most constant, most life-changing book that has ever existed. And that in itself is another valid indicator of its authenticity, because truth stands the test of time unchanged. And that is the case for the Bible. The message of the Bible has been the same since it was first inscribed as the Holy Spirit inspired people to write it. The Bible is a collection of 66 different books. 39 in the Old Testament. They were written between 1400 and 400 BC. And then there's 27 in the New Testament, which were written between 50 and 100 AD. These books were written by 40 vastly different authors in 3 different languages, which are Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek, and overall a time period of 1,500 years. And the Bible also contains discussions on a variety of different topics, things like history, geography, geology, archaeology, genealogy, poetry, prophecy, and theology. Yet in spite of all this, in spite of the time period over which all these books were written, the variety of different topics that it contains, the message, the viewpoint, the facts, the history, and the theology of the Bible are consistent across all the books. There should be one there, son. There you go. All this has remained intact over the course of human history since it was written. This alone, that all by itself, that alone, is impossible to explain in human terms without divine intervention and divine planning. So before we even get into these tests, we've got some very good indicators of the truth in the Bible just from those points. But like I said, we're going to talk about these other tests, so let's move on to that. So there are 3 different tests that historians use to validate a piece of literature. They are the bibliographic test, the internal test, and the external test. First of all, the bibliographic test. Should have one here, son. Determines how accurately the existing copies of a document were transcribed from the original. It determines how many copies of the original document exist, what variation exists between the copies, and how much time has passed between the original copies and the original and the earliest copies. That's what I meant to say. So that, in a nutshell, is the bibliographic test. Then there's the internal test, which examines the credibility of the claims made by the author. And then the third one is the external test, which examines outside sources for confirmation of the claims made by the author. Now, in addition to those 3 tests that are always used for pieces of literature, the Bible actually gives us a 4th test that we can use, because 30% of the Bible contains prophecy. Therefore, we can throw a 4th test at it. We'll call it the prophecy test, to determine the authenticity of the Bible. So what we're going to do now is look at each one of these 4 tests. We're going to do the first 2 today, and we're going to do the next 2 next week. So let's start with the bibliographic test. And in regard to this, Reverend Kenneth W. Rhodes, Jr. writes the following. There are more than 5,000 known Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, over 10,000 Latin, and about 9,000 other early versions. In all, there are more than 25,000 manuscript copies of the New Testament existing today. No other work of antiquity comes close to the manuscript attestation of the New Testament. In comparison, Homer's Iliad has a total of 643 manuscripts that exist today. The importance of the sheer number of manuscripts today cannot be underestimated. The abundance of manuscript copies makes it possible to reconstruct the original documents with almost complete accuracy. The time interval between the original to the extant copies establishes the fact that myth or error did not have time to enter into the manuscript tradition. In citing Sir Frederick Kenyon, Reverend Rhodes also writes the following. The interval then between the dates of the original composition and the earliest extant evidence becomes so small as to be in fact negligible, and the last foundation for any doubt that the scriptures have come down to substantially as they were written has now been removed. Both the authenticity and the general integrity of the books of the New Testament may be regarded as finally established. So, Reverend Rhodes, Gary Berger, and a number of other people have provided comparisons of the New Testament documents versus other writings of antiquity that are considered to be historically trustworthy. For example, Homer's Iliad was written in 800 BC. The earliest existing copies are from 400 BC, giving us a time gap of 400 years. And there's 643 copies today. And the textual criticism has been able to state that the percentage of accuracy of transmission is 95%. Herodotus' history was written between 480 and 425 BC. The earliest copies that we have are from 900 AD, which gives a time gap of 1,350 years. There are only 8 copies of this existing today. Therefore, the percentage of accuracy of transmission is considered to be unknown. Julius Caesar wrote Gallic Wars between 100 and 44 BC. The earliest existing copies are from 900 AD. So here we have a time gap of 1,000 years, and there's only 10 copies of this existing today. So again, the accuracy of transmission is considered unknown. Pliny Secundus wrote Natural History between 61 and 113 AD. The earliest copies are from 850 AD, so we have a time gap of 750 years. And there's only 7 copies of this in existence today. Therefore, the accuracy of transmission is considered unknown. Tacitus wrote Annals in 100 AD. The earliest copies are from 1100 AD. Here we have another time gap of 1,000 years. There's only 20 copies of this existing today, so the accuracy of transmission is considered unknown. So, looking at those now by comparison, the books of the New Testament were written between 50 and 100 AD. The earliest copies we have of these are from 114, 200, 250, and 325 AD. So with these, we only have time gaps of 50, 100, 150, and 225 years. Notice those are much smaller than the time gaps of the other examples I just went through. And there are 5,366 Greek copies existing today. Notice with the other ones, every number was less than 20. And the accuracy of transmission has been calculated to be 99%. And please remember, the 5,336 Greek copies are just that, just the Greek copies. There's also 10,000 Latin copies existing today, and 9,300 more that are in other languages. Things like Slavic, Ethiopic, Armenian, Arabic, etc., giving us a total of about 25,000 copies of the books of the New Testament. 25,000 copies. Please note, the other ones we were talking 7, 10, 20. There is no comparison here. And incidentally, I said it was considered to be 99% transmission accuracy. The 1% of variation discovered in the copies of the New Testament books is only minor grammatical variations. Things like spelling and terminology. And there are no variations in things like the literature on which core beliefs or theology are based.
So you're talking about the new translations? The new
That is
Living,
correct.
The new King James, that's what you speak.
So, because of that, you still get the meaning, the divine revelation, the theology, all of that from any English version of the Bible today, because they all reference the copies of the original text. Does that make sense?
That's not considered changing anything, though, right?
Nope. What we learned from all this information that I just went through is that of the often referenced writings of antiquity, like the ones that I mentioned are some of the most common, the New Testament writings have the shortest time spans from when they were written to when their texts were found. The shorter the time span, the less chance of errors or mistakes or fraudulence, whatever, to be introduced into those documents. So our New Testament writings of these other antiquity documents have the shortest time span. We also learned that they have the most copies, by a long shot, of the original texts existing today. None of these other documents of antiquity that are often referenced come anywhere even close. The more text you have verifying the same accounts, the greater the veracity of those texts. So let me back up here and give you a comparison. One of the writers that I mentioned was Tacitus. Okay, he wrote Annals. His writings provide what we use for the complete history of the Roman Empire. Yet they have a time gap of 1,000 years and only 20 or fewer copies of those texts existing today. In comparison, the New Testament writings have a time gap of only 50 to 200 years, and we have over 25,000 copies of those texts existing today. Yet our society accepts as factual, without question, the Roman history that the Roman texts contain, and doubts the authenticity of the books of the New Testament, even though the bibliographic test makes them the most authenticated historical documents known to man. The plain fact is that there are no other documents of history, zero, nada, zip, none, whatever you want to call it, that have anything even close to the authenticity that the Bible has. Dr. Ravi Zacharias writes the following: in real terms, the New Testament is easily the best attested ancient writing in terms of the sheer number of documents, the time span between the events and the document, and the variety of documents available to sustain or contradict it. There is nothing in ancient manuscript evidence to match such textual availability and integrity. Here's another quote from F.F. Bruce, who is a professor of biblical criticism at the University of Manchester, writes the following: the evidence for our New Testament writings is ever so much greater than the evidence for many writings of classical authors, the authenticity of which no one dreams of questioning. And if their New Testament were a collection of secular writings, their authenticity would generally be regarded as beyond all doubt. Therein is the key point of that. If this was a secular document, nobody would question it. Wayne Jackson writes the following: the accumulation of manuscript evidence has been so vast, and the work of the scientific textual critic so precise, that we may express complete confidence in the reliability of the New Testament text. While it is true that some minor manuscript variations exist, they are negligible. As I said, we're talking about things like grammar and spelling. Referencing Henry Thiessen, Jackson also writes, Westcott and Hort felt that the significantly debatable portions of the New Testament text could hardly amount to more than 1,000th part of the whole, the equivalent of a little more than half a page in the Greek New Testament. And in reference to this, Jackson continues, let me emphasize how impressive this fact really is. The New Testament documents have been in existence almost 1,900 years, okay? For 15 of these centuries, they were replicated solely by hand. In spite of this, there are only some 12 to 20 significant textual variations in the entire New Testament, and none of these affect an important doctrinal matter. And it's not just writers of antiquity that we can do these comparisons with. We can also do these with more contemporary writers. For example, one of the best-loved playwrights out there is William Shakespeare. Although I have absolutely no idea why, because I just don't get that fella. That's me, all right? However, as opposed to the manuscripts of the New Testament being around for 1,900 years, and most of them being replicated solely by hand, and yet, as we just learned, have an infinitesimally small number of variations. On the other hand now, Shakespeare's writings have only been around for 400 years. So listen to this. Referencing H.L. Hastings, Jackson writes the following. Consider the works of William Shakespeare. These writings have existed less than 4 centuries, and since the invention of the printing press. And yet, in every one of Shakespeare's 37 plays, there are probably 100 readings still in dispute, a large number of which materially affect the meaning of the passages in which they occur. Now, as opposed to the New Testament, the Old Testament books don't have as many copies existing today. But we still have some. And one example of those existing copies is what people refer to as the Dead Sea Scrolls. What, you got to see them? That's cool. That's cool. They were discovered in March of 1947 in some Qumran caves. The Dead Sea Scrolls contain all the books of the Old Testament except Esther. And as you might imagine, they have contributed greatly to determining the accuracy of transmission of the Old Testament books. In reference to this, Reverend Rhodes writes the following. Until the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oldest complete extant Hebrew manuscript was from around 900 AD. So the time gap here is about 1,300 years from original to copy. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls in March of 1947 contributed considerably to the certainty of the transmission accuracy of the Old Testament documents. The Dead Sea Scrolls date back to about 125 BC, and these manuscripts are 1,000 years older than your manuscripts that were previously possessed. So, the Dead Sea Scrolls reduced the time gap from original to copy, which was previously 1,300 years, down to now only 300 years. And Reverend Rhodes references Josh McDowell when he writes the following. One such scroll that was discovered was a copy of Isaiah. And when compared to the previous copy of Isaiah, the exactness of the transmission of Old Testament documents became manifest. Of the 166 words in Isaiah 53, there are only 17 letters in question. 10 of those are a matter of spelling. which doesn't affect the sense. 4 more letters are minor stylistic changes like conjunctions. Okay? The remaining 3 letters comprise the word light, which is added in verse 11 and doesn't affect the meaning greatly. Furthermore, this word is supported by the Septuagint and the first Isaiah scroll from the cave of Qumran. Thus, in one chapter of 166 words, there's only one word, 3 letters, in question after 1,000 years of transmission. And this word does not significantly change the meaning of the passage. Another thing that was learned from the discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls was the painstaking efforts that people had to go through when they were copying their manuscripts in order to ensure accuracy. There was an extensive laundry list of do's and don'ts that you had to abide by when copying the Old Testament scriptures. And it included things like what they wore, how they prepared their ink, what color the ink was, the spacing of the letters in the paragraphs, the type of parchment that they used, that they couldn't write anything at all from memory. And they had to actually look at each letter before they copied it. And they couldn't speak to anyone while they were copying the text that included the king. All of this evidence tells us that the Bible passes the bibliographic test unlike any other document in the history of mankind. But like I said, there's 3 more tests we can stand the Bible up against. So let's move on to the second one, which is the internal test. The internal test examines the credibility of the claims made by the author. And when they apply this test, historians typically adhere to what they call Aristotle's adage, which means you give the document the benefit of the doubt. Unless the document is the Bible, of course, right? The internal test is used to determine if the manuscript contains any errors, contradictions, or inaccuracies. And the author's the author's credibility is tightly linked to the closeness to the accounts they're recording. And this closeness, there we go, is both the period of time in which they lived and their geographical location. And in most cases, Jonah, we missed one here. So there's your fill in there was closeness. So they're looking at how close they were if they were living in the same place and if they were living in the same time when the events they're recording happened, okay? And in most cases, the writers of the books of the Bible were eyewitnesses to the events that they recorded in their books. So let me give you some examples. In the Old Testament, Moses wrote what they call the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, and he was the central figure in Exodus. He was also the one to whom God handed down the Jewish law. Joshua wrote the book of Joshua, and he lived the accounts that are recorded in his book. And that same thing holds true for the 2 books of Samuel, the books of Ezra, Nehemiah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and all the other prophets. Now, if you go to the New Testament, the 4 Gospels were written by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I always thought that was the infield for the Dodgers, but I guess it's not, huh? Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. We know that Matthew, Luke, and John were all eyewitnesses to Jesus' ministry. Matthew and John were 2 of his 12 disciples. And they were with him daily for almost 4 years during his ministry. And Luke actually tells us that he was an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, as well as the fact that he tells us he carefully investigated other eyewitness accounts. We get that from Luke 1, verses 1 to 3. Mark also records the eyewitness accounts of others, in particular Peter. Now, most of the letters in the New Testament were written by Paul, and they all contain information that he recorded of his own experiences and revelation. James, literal brother of Jesus, wrote the book of James. We have Peter, who wrote 2 of the letters that bear his name, and John also wrote 3 more letters that bear his name in the New Testament. Jude was another literal brother of Jesus, and he wrote the book that bears his name. The point of all this is that the vast majority of the Bible was written by people who lived what they transcribed, as well as living alongside others who witnessed and experienced these accounts. They were eyewitnesses to the events that they are recording in their respective books. And this alone attests to their credibility and their credentials. Just as when you go into a court of law, the purpose of an eyewitness is to tell people what they saw, what they heard, what they experienced. And they're credible because they were there. That's why they're credible. They were there. So after saying that, you could ask then, why are the 4 Gospels so different? And I actually want to address that before I move on here. All the 4 Gospels record Jesus' birth, his life, his ministry, his death, his resurrection, and his ascension. But each of the 4 Gospels was written for a unique purpose. Therefore, they were written in unique styles. They record different information to emphasize and fulfill each of their respective purposes. So, for example, Matthew, he was a Jew, and he was one of the 12 apostles. He wrote his gospel to the Jews. He wrote it between 37 and 68 AD, and it was written for the purpose to convince them Jesus was the Messiah and the King of the Jews. He wrote in Greek, which was the common language of the time, and Matthew includes a lot of Jewish laws and traditions and Old Testament references and prophecies about the Messiah that all the Jews would recognize. And he also begins his gospel with a genealogy of Jesus for the purpose of showing that Jesus was an heir to King David. Then we have Mark. He was also a Jew, and he was a close friend of Peter the apostle, as well as being a traveling companion with Paul and Barnabas. His name was Mark in Latin, but in Hebrew they called him John. That's why sometimes you see his name as John. Depends on the language. Mark wrote his gospel primarily to the Romans to announce the arrival of the Messiah. And so because of that, he omitted a lot of the details, references, and prophecies from the Old Testament that only the Jews would recognize, because he was writing to the Romans, okay? So because of that, Mark's gospel is shorter and to the point. It's the one that people refer to as being action-packed. It focuses a lot on Jesus' power, his miracles, his emotions, and his role as the suffering servant. Since he was writing to non-Jews, he had to explain a lot of the Jewish customs and traditions, etc. And he used Roman time because he's writing to the Romans instead of Hebrew time. And he also translated some of his words into Latin, trying to make it all easier for the Romans to follow. Next we have Luke, who was a Greek physician, and he was a friend of Paul's. He wrote his gospel to all the Gentiles for the purpose of presenting Jesus as the Savior of all mankind. Luke was a careful, meticulous historian, and he wrote in consecutive order. And he has datable references to historical figures, and he did all that because as an historian, it was important to him. And since he was not a Jew, he actually paid special attention to women in his gospel. So you'll see more references to women in his gospel than the others. And he wrote a lot about the prayer life of Jesus and also the nature of the Holy Spirit. He also includes 18 parables that you don't find in the other three gospels. So then we have John. John was a Jew and another one of the 12 apostles. He wrote his gospel to Gentile Christians to convince the world that Jesus was the Messiah and the Son of God. Unlike the other three gospels, which they refer to the other three as the synoptic gospels, and they largely are focusing on, they were written in the form of parables and sermons, and they're all set in Galilee. John's is a little different because his is largely in the form of conversations of Jesus, and it's all set in Judea. John's gospel also includes what's referred to as the 7 I am statements, which refer back to God's I am statement found in Exodus 3:14. John emphasized the deity of Jesus, and he describes his miracles as signs of confirmation of this fact. He also pays special attention to the nature of God and the relationship between the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit. So that's a little bit of background on how the four Gospels are different. But in spite of all this, in spite of the fact that they're unique, all four Gospel messages all agree. Should have one here, son. There you go. Because they were all witnesses to the events that they're recording. And that makes a strong case for their authenticity and their credibility. They all agree because these four writers either lived with Jesus or they interviewed people who lived with Jesus. They did investigative reporting, actually. And Luke obviously interviewed many witnesses. And I told you Mark interviewed Peter. That's what a lot of his is based on. And one other thing I'll tell you, Luke is considered today based on a lot of archaeology. Luke has become to be considered a master historian. And Luke tells us he was an eyewitness to Jesus' ministry, and he also includes that he carefully investigated other eyewitnesses. Again, we get that from Luke 1:1-3. And he also tells us in this same passage that his gospel is in fact an extensive investigative report. And he did this primarily for someone named Theophilus, so he could know the certainty of the truth of which he was taught. And this also tells us that Luke himself was close to these events, as well as close to all the other eyewitnesses that he interviewed. As with all the other three gospel writers, he transcribed his gospel in the same generation so that they could verify the veracity of his account. And this, like I said, is key to passing the internal test. But that doesn't hold just for the gospel writers. The same scenario is found over and over for the writers of the Old Testament and the New Testament. They themselves were eyewitnesses to the events that they recorded. And that provides their credibility and authenticity. And the Bible actually contains a lot of references to the eyewitnesses of the events that were transcribed. Let me give you a few of them. Joshua 22:28. He says this, "And we said, if they ever say this to us or to our descendants, we will answer. Look at the replica of the Lord's altar, which our ancestors built, not for burnt offerings and sacrifices, but as a witness between us and you." And then how about Isaiah 30, verse 8? It says this, "Go now, write it on a tablet for them, inscribe it on a scroll, that for the days to come it may be an everlasting witness." Then we have Luke 24:28. He says, "You are witnesses of these things." And Luke also includes a number of statements like this in the book of Acts, which he also wrote. For example, Acts 2:32 says this, "God has raised this Jesus to life, and we are all witnesses of it." And you can find similar statements just like that in Acts 3:15, Acts 5:32, Acts 10:39, and Acts 13:30 and 31. And we also find similar statements like this from other New Testament writers, saying that they were eyewitnesses in 1 Corinthians 15:3-8, Hebrews 12:1, 2 Peter 1:16. And finally, one more let me share with you. 1 John 1:3, he writes this, "We proclaim to you what we have seen and heard, so that you also may have fellowship with us." So when you're writing in the generation, the same generation of those who also witnessed the events that you witnessed, you simply cannot afford to be inaccurate or fraudulent, because the other witnesses who were still alive would be able to discredit you and your writings. All those other witnesses who were still alive and reading what you wrote, they could turn into what sometimes our court has to deal with, hostile witnesses, right? So because of that, you can't afford to be inaccurate or fraudulent. Not only that, in these writings, they often tell them, if you don't believe it, go talk to the other people who witnessed it. Once again, if you're writing in the generation of people who lived this with you, you would never tell people to do that, because then you're just opening up trouble to have more people who could discredit what you're writing. Therefore, these writers had to be credible. They had to be accurate. They had every reason to be accurate, and they had no reasons to be fraudulent, because doing so would simply destroy their credibility. Now, in addition to this, over and over, the writers of the New Testament, in fact, you could say extensively, they either directly quote, reference, or allude to the writers of the Old Testament. And to put an exact number of times that's done, to put an exact number on it, is actually kind of difficult because of the slight variations. However, you can safely say that there are approximately 275 direct quotations of the Old Testament in the New Testament. When you add references and allusions, the number of Old Testament references in the New Testament climbs into the thousands. It gets so big that the New Testament, the writings of the New Testament, approximately 10% of them becomes the Old Testament. Now we're getting to a huge chunk. And these numerous citations provide even greater credibility to the writers of the Old Testament and the writers of the New Testament who are referencing them. People will frequently make claims against the credibility of the Bible and the writers. And they always say things, when they do this, they will say it's due to inconsistencies. However, those claims can be easily refuted when you look at things like intent, context, and barriers, meaning things like language, culture, and geography. For example, as I already shared with you, some of the alleged inconsistencies in the four Gospels can easily be attributed to the fact that each one of them wrote them for a different purpose. And they were each written uniquely because they had a unique target audience. In reference to context and barriers, Gary Berger writes the following. Let's suppose the crime you witnessed was in another country. You'd have some additional barriers to relating your testimony in a credible way. But it's not because you didn't accurately see what happened or that you want to distort the truth. The barriers to communication come from differences in things like language, cultural values, and geographical features. In a similar way, when we're reading the Bible and come across an inconsistency, it may be that we are literally missing something in the translation. Most inconsistencies have been reconciled when scholars learn more about the context in which it was written. Some of these contexts are language, culture, and geography. Every language has its own genre of literature, figures of speech, and idioms. Every culture has differences in philosophical, religious, and economic outlooks. Geography is important as well. What might be normal in the temperate Piedmont of North Carolina might not be normal in a desert in the Middle East. The apparent contradictions have been reconciled. Any minor inconsistencies that have not been reconciled are just that, minor inconsistencies that don't have a significant bearing on the meaning of the text. Furthermore, Berger writes this, that brings us to the other question we must ask about inconsistency. Just how big is it? If you told your eyewitness testimony in a courtroom, I'll guarantee you that it will not agree in every detail with the other eyewitnesses, even if you and they are earnestly attempting to recount the true story. You'll disagree on things like the number of people, the clothes they were wearing, the kind of vehicle, or the time of day, and many other points. Does this mean the court should throw out your whole testimony as being not credible just because it differs slightly from the other? No. In fact, it would be very suspicious if all your testimonies were identical. This would mean that you all got together and agreed beforehand on what the story was going to be. This would be collusion, and it would severely undermine your testimony. So, as Berger just points out here, what's critical is that the testimonies must be in complete agreement on the major points. Their testimonies must be in complete agreement on the significant details supporting those major points. The testimonies must contain an acceptable amount of variation on the non-supporting details, and the eyewitnesses must be given the benefit of the doubt. So when you take this information together on intent, context, and barriers, and when you handle it appropriately, alleged inconsistencies of the Bible are easily explained, they're easily understood, and they can be easily refuted. Thereby, the credibility of the writers and the veracity of their accounts are easily upheld. So with that, that's the end of what I wanted to share with you with the internal test. So I'm going to stop there, and next week we will discuss the external test and we'll discuss the prophecy test. So we'll stop here and pick it up there next week.